So today we're going to talk about how the New World changed because of the Columbian Exchange. So our key concept is the same as last time, that contact among Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans resulted in the Columbian Exchange, and there were significant social, cultural, and political changes on both sides of the Atlantic. However, we're going to focus on the Columbian Exchange and the development of the Spanish Empire in present-day Mexico, New Mexico area, California area, how that changed the Western Hemisphere demographically, economically, and socially. So Spanish exploration and conquest were accompanied and furthered by widespread deadly epidemics that devastate the native populations throughout the New World. And they were accompanied by the introduction of new crops and animals that were not previously found in the Americas. The most deadly, that we're going to talk about, most deadly epidemic or disease that was spread by the Spanish and by the Europeans in general in the New World was smallpox. It was introduced and spread through Mexico and South America and later affects North America. It devastated up to, scientists predict or estimate, up to 90% of the native population are killed by smallpox and other diseases. Smallpox kills a third or more Native Americans in just a few months. In the 1630s, for example, it kills off half of the native population in North American Massachusetts. Native Americans, unlike Europeans, had never developed any sort of immunity to smallpox, so they were particularly susceptible when they interacted with people with smallpox or with any sort of carrier virus. Most Europeans, and this is disgusting, viewed smallpox as God's gift because it quickly wiped out any sort of Native American resistance that Europeans would have encountered when they came to the New World. So when the Europeans came to the New World, it wasn't that the Native Americans didn't care that the Europeans were taking over, it's that many people had died, and those who had not died of smallpox and other diseases were just trying to survive. Later, and this is not really for this unit, but I think it's very interesting and awful, during the French and Indian War, which is like the 1750s, there's a man named Lord Geoffrey Amherst who gave infected blankets, like blankets that had been wrapped around someone with smallpox, that he gave it to Native Americans to lessen the population and lessen resistance in the French and Indian War. Other diseases such as typhoid spread as well, which I'll mention briefly later. But Native Americans, I guess as kind of the revenge, gifted Europeans with syphilis. So take that for what you will and what you've learned in health class. We also see the introduction of species to the New World. Horses, cattle, sheep, and pigs were all introduced by the Europeans to the New World. Wheat, rice, barley, and oats were also introduced from Africa and Europe to the New World, and America for the first time experiences diseases like smallpox, typhus, measles, influenza, whooping cough, and malaria once they are exposed to these diseases that came again from Europe and Africa through the Columbian Exchange to the New World. Because horses were introduced to the Americas, bison hunting on the Great Plains picks up, and eventually we see a change in the bison population. Prior to 1500, only the Blackfeet, Shoshone, and Crow Indians hunted bison, and that was very difficult without horses. Around the 1600s, the Pueblo Indians captured horses from Spanish invaders, and this was a game changer because now they could hunt bison using horses, though they only hunted bison in small numbers. However, I just want you to kind of have a spoiler. In 1800, because of the railroads, American poachers were sent to kill a large number of the bison population. And starting in 1700, we see a lot of tribes had been pushed onto the Great Plains because of British and French settlers in North America. We see bison, because of that, losing their canyon shelter, and they were moved onto the open plains. Many bison die of cold and starvation in the winter. So yes, horses were introduced, but it wasn't until settlers actually pushed the bison onto the Great Plains and eventually sent poachers to hunt the bison that we see a large decrease in the bison population. We do see an interesting setup of the Spanish structure in the New World. The Spanish controlled the new territory of New Spain using provinces. They were ruled by viceroys or a royal governor who was a representative of the king. They had plantations called haciendas. And they had some sort of plantation system called the encomienda system, which we'll talk about. But that's kind of the structure we see. The king controls the province, but the province is technically ruled by a royal governor in New Spain, which is Mexico. So in each of these provinces, there are haciendas or large plantations, and they use the encomienda system to actually gather resources. So the encomienda system, Spanish colonial economies used Native American labor, slave labor, to support the plantation-based agriculture and to extract precious metals or mine other resources. The first thing we're going to talk about are sugar plantations. In New Spain, this is post-Columbus, post-1492. Sugar is introduced to the Madeira and Canary Islands. Spanish settlers introduced their colonial governments that we've just spoke about and their plantation system for sugar farms. This was one of the first practices of institutionalized slavery in the New World, the encomienda system. Native Americans and later Africans were used on the farms to make it sugar plantation or sugar farming more profitable. The earliest large-scale sugar plantation using the encomienda system was in Brazil, and we also see large examples in the Caribbean islands. By the 1500s, dry sugar replaces the European demand for honey, and the sugar plantation economy grows. Slaves are also used in silver mines. One of the largest silver mines that we will discuss is in Potosi, Bolivia, where there are 40,000 tons of silver mined. Indigenous people or Native Americans were forced to work in the mines in dangerous and brutal conditions, and many died of mercury poisoning. 30,000 Africans later were brought to work in the mines once the Native American workers began to die, and the African miners also experienced death in exponential numbers. European traders partner with some African groups who already practiced slavery in Africa and would forcibly extract slave labor and sell people who were from Africa to slave traders who then brought them to America. So the Spanish imported many enslaved Africans for labor in the plantation, agriculture, and mining systems, the encomienda system. But we see that start within, there's already a slave trade in Africa. The Europeans just capitalize on that and bring many people who are enslaved to the Americas. So it's even bigger than we discuss really in world history. It all starts with something called the line of demarcation. In 1494, the Pope draws a line down the Atlantic, this purple line, to separate Spanish and Portuguese exploration territory. This is known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. Spain gets the western area to explore, which is the New World, and Portugal gets the eastern area to explore, which is Brazil and Africa. Portugal controls the slave trade coming from West Africa and would sell slaves to Spain, who bought them for work in America to mine and work on sugar plantations. Spain would then send all new resources that they've gleaned from the land using slave labor. They would send those resources to Europe to sell, and then Portugal would receive that money. That money would make its way down to Portugal, who would buy slaves from African traders from the African continent. The Portugal had set up slave trading ports on the coast. And they would ship imprisoned people to America. And that was our beginning of that triangular trade that we're going to talk about. Doctors would inspect Africans who were sold into slavery, and they would give slave catchers guns, powders, spirits, textiles, and trinkets in money in exchange for enslaved Africans. And I know that you've talked about this. Here's just a quick little visual if you want some more information, especially if you are planning on using some statistics and facts, which gets you points on essays, which we'll talk about later. You've learned about the Middle Passage. I'm going to give you some raw material here. The Middle Passage brought Africans to the West Indies or the Caribbean islands, where they were bought as slaves to work on plantations and in mines in New Spain. The Middle Passage took about 3 weeks to get from Africa to the Americas, but it took longer if the weather was bad. It could take up to 3 months. Passengers on the Middle Passage were packed beneath the deck, 2 by 2, and they would force to lie on the ground as close as possible to fit more people. Air holes were cut into the deck, but air holes were closed if there was a storm, and many times there were storms as you crossed the Atlantic. Many Africans died of illness, suffocation, disease, and once someone died, they were thrown overboard. However, an alive person could be changed to a dead person, and the people on the boat, the captains on the boat, the boat hands may not see that someone has died for many days before that person is thrown overboard. So imagine that trauma of lying next to someone who is deceased. There were numerous uprisings. Please do not think that people aboard the Middle Passage just passively went to the New World. However, few uprisings were successful. Between 10 and 20 million Africans were sold into slavery once they survived the Middle Passage, and many, many people died prior to reaching the New World. The last thing that I will talk about with you guys is the caste system, the Spanish caste system in New Spain, which again is that area of Mexico. The caste system incorporated and defined the status of the diverse populations in New Spain. So the Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans within the Spanish Empire in the New World, they were all put into different levels. So think about it like a triangle. And this is an image, a copyright-free image that I wanted to use. That top portion, those are the most powerful people. The people on the bottom are the least powerful people, just like you learned about in world history. So at the top of society, we have the Peninsulares, or the Spaniards who were born in Spain and came to New Spain, okay? Then the second level, second most powerful people are called the Creoles. These are people who are Spanish, but they were born in the New World. Like your parents came from Spain to the New World, then they had you. You were the second highest in society. You were born in New Spain, but you are Spanish. Then we have mestizos. That means mixed race. Mestizos have one parent who's Native American and one parent who is Spanish. Then the next level down, you would be a Native American, yeah, I guess we'll just say that's the name of that fourth level. If you are Native American, eventually Spain does not enslave you, but you are not considered high in society. The only way to better life for your child is to marry someone who is Spanish. And then the lowest in society are mulatto, or dark skin, African slave status. If you guys have any questions, please let me know.